Israel actually plans to exterminate the entire Arab Muslim population of the world. And the Muslims know this. And this is why their jihadism and their excesses have some basis in reality. They're trying to survive because they know that Israel simply is interested only in genocide and exterminating all the Arab people, bringing them under complete domination. And the Israelis are always exterminationists.
Are they creating a Christian-Muslim war?
Yes, that's all deliberate. See, there is no Christian-Muslim war. Now, I have filed legal papers in this town here before in a law case that I have going on, in which I state frankly that 1 billion Christians and 1 billion Muslims are now at a war to the death with each other, and the only victor will be the state of Israel, because Israel is getting rid of all of its rivals and all of its competitors at one fell swoop. It's a brilliant move, and it's also totally calculated and ruthless.
Is the real enemy Israel?
Yeah. Or Zionism, world Zionism. The state of Israel is nothing. It never has been. It's the tiniest state in the world, yet this is the most important state in the world. It's the most important state to the entire United States government because they put the interests of Israel before every other consideration, including the United States. Well, Ezra is the dominant intellectual of the 20th century, and 4 of his proteges have been named have been given the Nobel Prize for Literature after he edited the work. And the first one is T.S. Eliot. He first edited his poem *The Wasteland* in 1920 in Paris, and that became the most famous poem of the 20th century. It's not mentioned very much today, but in the 30s and 40s, every college student could recite *The Wasteland*. And that's how young men would pick up girls, is by talking about the wasteland. They'd get interested and go to a bar and have sex. So it was very useful. And after *The Wasteland*, he became Ernest Hemingway's mentor, and he edited Ernest Hemingway, and he made Hemingway's prose very crisp. And Hemingway had been a hack newspaper writer for a firm called, it was a newspaper called the Moose Jaw Herald in Saskatchewan, Canada. That was his stellar background to become a writer. And so Pound took his material and tightened it up, and he just had a knack for doing that. He could edit anybody's. See, the people, his proteges were all very dissimilar people. T.S. Eliot was a very stuffy Harvard graduate. Ernest Hemingway was a doctor's son from Chicago. His father committed suicide, and he committed suicide when he was 61. And I think one of his sons has committed suicide. So they have a knack for it. And so that was 2 of his proteges. And then William Butler Yeats is in all the anthologies. When Pound met William Butler Yeats in London, he was a very, very famous poet at that time. But he was writing stuffy Victorian poetry. And so Ezra was horrified by that, and he got him totally out of that and into more modern poetry. And so he became much more famous, and he got the Nobel Prize for that. And then his fourth protege was James Joyce, who wrote Ulysses, one of the most famous books of the 20th century. And Pound edited that, and James Joyce was a terrible writer, and he edited his prose, and that became the most famous book of the 20th century. It was Ulysses was the Bible of the 1930s. Everybody talked about it. And so there was 4 Nobel Prizes for literature for one writer. It's the only time in history that a writer has ever had one protege get the Nobel Prize for literature. And by coincidence, I'm his last living protege. They're all dead, long gone except me. And so I'm patiently waiting my turn. And Ezra Pound himself was never named for the Nobel Prize, although 4 of his pupils were, simply because he never cultivated the establishment. He never, well, in the 1930s and 1940s, you really had to be a very active, outspoken pro-communist to get anywhere. So, of course, he was totally ignored by everybody, except the public. The public liked his work. And his novels were all bestsellers. They made a movie of For Whom the Bell Tolls. That's the most famous book, but he actually wrote some others that were quite good. So Ezra had these 4 proteges who got the Nobel Prize when I met him, and he really jumped on me and started whipping me into shape. And he assigned me to go to the Library of Congress and see what I could find out about the Federal Reserve System. Well, I really had a knack for research, and I found out the entire history of the Federal Reserve System, which is the greatest swindle ever known in history, where a group of private bankers conspired criminally to take over the money and credit of the United States, which they did in 1913, and they passed the Federal Reserve Plan through the Democratic Party in Washington, D.C., and it became a law of Congress. And this law handed over to this private bank all of the money and credit of the United States, which was a pretty good day's work. And they've kept it ever since, because they set it up as a monopoly so that the stock of the Federal Reserve banks could never be traded publicly. It could only be handed down in a family, or if a corporation bought the bank that owned it, they became possessors of the stock. You've never been able to buy, since 1914, you've not been able to buy a share of Federal Reserve Bank stock on the market anywhere. And that is monopoly. That's what they have. It's a monopoly. You see, they're totally insulated against anyone buying control of the Federal Reserve System. And John D. Rockefeller was one of the biggest holders, and he had his stock placed under the Rockefeller Foundation, so it can never be bought or sold. So it's secure forever. And the other people who bought control in 1914, they were the Schiff family and the Warburg family. And, of course, they still have their own family fortunes, and they have a controlling interest in Federal Reserve Bank stock in various Federal Reserve Banks. It's not all in one Federal Reserve Bank. It's in a number of Federal Reserve Banks. And I think most of the holders of the Federal Reserve Bank have at least stock in at least 5 of the Federal Reserve Banks.
What are the consequences of having the Federal Reserve control the monetary system of the United States?
Well, the consequences are very important, and they're never discussed by any economist in the United States. The Federal Reserve Bank is a central bank. And a central bank, this is not taught in any economics class in the United States or in the world. A central bank is a bank of issue, which has the right to print all the money it wants. That's what a bank of issue means. You can print all the money you want. There's no control over it whatsoever. And right now, the Federal Reserve Bank is printing trillions of dollars, which are almost worthless, and they're looking for hyperinflation, actually, because it'll be a repeat of 1924 in Germany. But I think they've taken some precautions. It probably won't happen, because they've been through all that. They know exactly what will happen. And in hyperinflation, the money becomes worthless to the point where you have to have a wheelbarrow full of currency, paper currency, to buy a loaf of bread, which is normally worth 18 cents at that time. So they don't want to go through that again, so they're taking care of that. But the Federal Reserve has printed so much of this paper fiat currency, debt money, that it's overloaded the world. China and Japan have trillions of dollars of our so-called national debt, which is our currency. And, of course, they know that when it goes, it goes. When a currency becomes worthless, nothing's more worthless than a currency that becomes worthless. So they're staving off the inevitable by hedging and doing what they can. But once you buy this debt, this paper dollar currency, you're stuck with it unless you can find another sucker to take it off your hands. And there's nobody right now who wants any part of it. So China and Japan are stuck with it. And they bought this currency to maintain trade with the United States. That's all it was for. So in effect, we're financing our trade with China, trade with Japan by our Federal Reserve currency, which is due to federal. It's not federal any more than the Federal Express Company is a federal company. And it has no reserves because it doesn't need any reserves because it prints its own currency. If you could print your own money, what do you need of reserves? You just go and warm up the printing press and turn out another $10 billion. So, and finally, it's not a system. It's called the Federal Reserve System. It's not federal. It has no reserves. And it's not a system, but I'm the only person in the world who's ever defined it in my works as a criminal syndicate. And that's what it is. It's a criminal syndicate, just like the mafia, which is one of its subsidiaries, and the CIA and all of the criminal syndicates work out of the Federal Reserve System. Because that's what a Federal Reserve System is. A central bank is a group of bankers which have total control of a nation's economy. And they print their own money, print as much as they want to, and it eventually becomes worthless and through speculation. See, a central bank is set up for speculation. The Federal Reserve System was set up solely for speculation, and its author, Paul Warburg, who was a partner of Kuhn Loeb Company in New York, which, by the way, financed the Communist Revolution, financed the Hitler Revolution, and financed the Japanese entry into World War II. So I defined in my work that a central bank's principal role is for war finance, because war finance is the most profitable enterprise you can get into. And so if you're a banker, you're looking for the best investment you can make, which is a war. For instance, the Iraq War. Now, when they set up the Iraq War, Halliburton and Company, which is the oil production company, or an oil equipment company, actually, but it finances the big oil explorations. And they found out that, oil companies found out that a war is the most profitable investment you can have. During World War I, Rockefeller, out of his patriotic goodwill, upped the price of oil 5 times to the U.S. government. That's how we won the war. And that's how he became, he was already the richest man in the world. And the richest man in the world wants to become the richest man in the universe, which is your next step. And apparently he made that. So that's what it comes. People wonder why a billionaire wants more money. Now, H.L. Hunt's sons, 4 sons, each one of them started off life at 21 with $1 billion at that time. And as you can imagine, they haven't thrown it away. So they were, on paper, they're worth about $2 billion apiece at the present time. But who knows what their holdings are.
How was the Federal Reserve set up?
Well, it was set up as 12 districts. See, we had 48 states in the United States at that time. So you would think that the logical way would be to set up a Federal Reserve Bank in each state and have the 48 Federal Reserve banks. But instead, they carved the United States into 12 districts of their own, which they called Federal Reserve districts. And these 12 Federal Reserve districts are actually the government of the United States. They override the states and they override the federal government. And not many people know that. They don't know that this is the Federal Reserve System of the United States. the Federal Reserve districts.
Why didn't the American people rise up or say something about it?
They didn't say anything about it because it was a hidden conspiracy. Now I'm always called a conspiratologist, and people say I see conspiracies everywhere. But as I told a reporter for the Dallas Morning News a couple of years ago in a front page story, I said I've never had to invent a conspiracy in my life. There are more conspiracies than I can possibly write about. So it's not a question of seeing conspiracies under every bed. It's a question of seeing conspiracies in every commercial activity and every political activity that goes on in this country. Because they always have a hidden agenda, which means that the conspirators have to keep their identities concealed. And it's always criminal in nature because they always have some criminal objective to attain by operating this conspiracy. That makes it all persons involved in a conspiracy for a criminal purpose automatically become criminals, criminally liable. And that is the case of everybody who has anything to do with the Federal Reserve System. They're criminally liable for participating in a criminal conspiracy. And there's no other definition that you can make because under law, a person who is involved in a criminal conspiracy is a criminal. And that's the upshot of the whole thing. There's nothing more to be said.
Why doesn't Congress control the money?
Well, Thomas Jefferson and the writers of the Constitution specifically designated the Congress to control the money. And they designated that the monetary unit of the United States would be gold and silver. There is no specification anywhere in the Constitution for paper money. And what the Federal Reserve conspiracy of 1913 did, it made lawful a paper currency which the Constitution did not authorize. But they passed it through Congress, so it became public law of Congress, and that made it official that the Federal Reserve dollar became the monetary unit of the United States as paper currency, which totally defied the Constitution, which provided that only gold and silver could be the monetary unit of the United States, and that only Congress would control the monetary unit of the United States. So it was doubly unconstitutional at its outset. It's become more unconstitutional every day since.
Is there any gold left in Fort Knox?
No one knows. I worked with a man named Edward Durrell who spent quite a fortune of his own, probably $100 million, trying to prove that there was no gold in Fort Knox. And apparently, I was able to prove it, but they never published the fact that it's not there. And they had a number of congressmen go to Fort Knox, and they led them deep into the bowels of the earth, about 50 floors down in elevators. And there they were shown, through iron cages, they were shown some stacks of what were supposed to be gold bars. And they said, that's the gold stock of the United States. But the congressmen were not allowed to go past the gold bars, the bars of the gold bars. And they were not allowed to, I think they finally extricated one gold bar and handed it to them, and they more or less could see there was gold, which you cannot determine except by a chemical assay. And so a congressman was handed a gold bar, and he agreed this is the entire gold stock of the United States. And that is the only acknowledgement that we have gold at Fort Knox.
What is the difference between a gold or silver-backed currency as opposed to a fiat currency?
Well, fiat currency is paper currency, which is backed by paper money, which is what the Federal Reserve dollar is. And I say in my book that Congress in 1944, during World War II, when the American people were occupied with the war and so forth, Congress in 1944 hurriedly passed a law removing the last gold and silver from the backing of the U.S. dollar. So since 1944, the U.S. dollar has been a paper-backed money issued against paper bonds. It's paper on paper. So that's the status today. The United States dollar is more or less the trading currency of the entire world, and it's totally worthless. Has no backing of any kind.
What's wrong with paper or money?
Well, You can take a Federal Reserve dollar bill and go to any store in the United States and buy $1's worth of goods. And so it's worth $1. It's accepted as $1. But it's accepted, credit means I believe. So that means that any merchant who accepts a Federal Reserve dollar says, I believe that this is a real dollar. That's all there is to it. It's still a piece of green paper, which is worth what any green paper is. You can figure yourself. You can take a sheet of green paper and you can clip out $800, $100 bills.
So monopoly money is...
Monopoly money. It's the same as the game Monopoly.
What's wrong with central banks?
You have to understand that all the settlers who came to America, including my ancestor William Mullins, were fleeing European oppression. And this oppression was primarily government officials working for private banks who were oppressing the people, charging them too much interest or usury, and taking their homes and property because they didn't have enough cash to pay off the debt. And so people finally fed up and set sail for the United States to get away from this. So, of course, every settler who came to the United States was totally against banks because they were running away from banks. That's why they came here. So obviously they did not welcome the idea of setting up banks on U.S. soil. They were firmly opposed to it. And Charles Lindbergh capitalized on that sentiment of the American people when he led the fight in Congress against the Federal Reserve System in 1913. And his son, Charles Lindbergh Jr., became a very famous aviator and a world figure. And his entire public career, he never mentioned the Federal Reserve, which his father gave up his political career for. So he was run out of Congress because he voted against the Federal Reserve System. Every congressman who voted against the Federal Reserve System in 1913 was run out of Congress the following year. New York banks sent in somebody to run against him, and they were lavishly financed with printing press money, and they put him right out of office. And there's never been, since 1914, anyone in Congress, except one or two isolated instances, we've never had anyone in Washington who would criticize the Federal Reserve System. Just as on television, you never have a radio program which will criticize the Federal Reserve System. Of course, you have three competing networks there who are ostensibly economic rivals and very dedicated rivals, and yet they totally agree on everything like the Federal Reserve System and foreign policy and so forth. We've got to defeat Hitler, and we've got to defeat communism. We've got to defeat Nazism. Well, if you ask the average man in the street in the 1940s if he wants to defeat communism, he says yes, because his newspapers and his politicians tell him we've got to defeat communism. At the very time of the Cold War with communism, the United States taxpayer was totally financing the Soviet Union, which had been insolvent since 1917 and which had been maintained by the United States taxpayer ever since. And Woodrow Wilson, who was born about 3 blocks from where we're sitting, initiated this system of financing the Soviet Union in 1917. When he voted, Congress voted him a special emergency war fund of $100 million, which at that time was the same as about $1 trillion at that time, to prosecute the war against Germany. And he took $10 million of that, 1/10 of it, and sent it to Russia to help the Bolsheviks in Russia. And there were no Bolsheviks in the United States Congress. So why did the U.S. Congress authorize him to send them $10 million? Well, they've been doing it ever since. It's
and
only been...
What is that reason?
Because bankers consider communism and dictatorship as a good investment. A banker considers a dictatorship as a perfect government because everybody is totally controlled, and if anybody objects to paying high taxes or to paying debts, you can put them in a concentration camp or execute them. which Stalin did in Russia, and which is the perfect system. No banker will ever tell you this. Well, David Rockefeller did during the 1940s. He said the reason he was so pro-communist at that time was because the communists collected their debts at the point of a gun, which he didn't say, but that's why they do it. And that is why dictatorship remains the ideal of all bankers.
What is the main mission of the Federal Reserve System today?
Well, my book, The World Order, goes into that quite extensively, which unfortunately is out of print. But I found out when I wrote that book that the main mission of the banks was to start wars. And I found out also that it's very difficult to start a war. If you want to start a war with Iraq, go out and try to do it. It's very tough. And it takes years of hard work. So Bush had a great advantage because his father was head of the Central Intelligence Agency and a worldwide drug distribution operation. So he had plenty of money and plenty of political influence. He had no problem at all to walk into Iraq, although Iraq had never fired a shot at the United States. You see, you declare war on another country when they invade your country and try to take your territory, or there has to be some very good reason to have a war, because you can understand that it's very difficult to get millions of people to run out and kill each other when they have absolutely no bone of contention whatsoever. In fact, all the wars have had... See, that's why Ezra got into this entire thing, and that's how he got me into it. He was living in Paris during World War I, and he had many young writers and artist friends who were drafted into the armies, and some were for Germany and some were for France, and they were killed. And he couldn't understand how these great talents, very brilliant young men, died for nothing. And when he spent years of studying the situation in 8 languages all over Europe, he found out that bankers make wars to create debt. And that's the only reason. And that's the only reason. We went to war against Germany in World War I and World War II at a time when by census, 52% of the population of the United States was of German origin. So this was like a civil war. The bankers, the central banks of Europe, and they couldn't have World War I. They'd been wanting World War I since 1885. But the central banks of Europe had already bankrupted every country in Europe. And it was impossible to have a war. They didn't have enough money. There wasn't a country in Europe, England, France, Germany, Russia. There wasn't a country in Europe which could finance one day's war anywhere. So that's why they were conspiring in the United States to get the Federal Reserve System passed, because the Federal Reserve System was conjured up simply to make World War I possible. Without the Federal Reserve, there would never have been a World War I. No American would ever have died in World War I. So you can say they were murdered by the bankers, because that was the only reason they were there.
So you say that they don't start the war, but they conspire to make it happen? I mean,
they make it happen, yes.
How do they do that? I mean,
well, they do that through worldwide conspiracies, through Masonic and other secret brotherhoods all over the world, which operate as criminal conspiracies, the Mafia, the Masons, and the Jesuits, and so forth. There are always these underground groups which are very profitable. When you get into one of those things, you get into very profitable situations. And when you're in one of these organizations, you become very wealthy yourself. Al Capone became one of the richest people in the United States. And he complained to the newspaper men. He said, "I'm just like any other businessman." And he was. All businessmen were like him, but they wouldn't admit it.
Is the United States government a corporate banking criminal enterprise?
Well, it's a conglomerate of various criminal enterprises. There are many criminal enterprises in the United States. Some are quite large and some are quite small.
But the government a criminal enterprise?
Always a criminal enterprise. Because the elections are completely staged and manipulated from the beginning to the end. The candidates are chosen through a very careful process of someone who will thoroughly agree with anything they want to do, foreign policy and economic policy. There are two ways you govern a country, and that's through economic policy and foreign policy. Because as far as a country itself, it's a limited operation. The United States is limited to the borders of this country.
Is the U.S. monetary system controlled by the Bank of England?
Oh, yes, it is. I say that in my book. The subtitle of my book, Secrets of the Federal Reserve, is The London Connection, in which I prove conclusively that London still runs the United States. See, London is still the world market of the world bankers. Not Washington, not New York, and not Tokyo, and not Berlin, but it's London. George Bush went public after I published this book. It had been published for about almost a year, and I'd sold maybe 100 copies because I never advertised my books. They were never reviewed. Nobody paid attention to it. And George Bush Sr. was president at that time, and in November of whatever year it was, he started going on the television and talking about the New World Order. And, of course, the only book on the World Order is my book. So I sold out immediately, which was very disconcerting because I have no publishing company, and I had to go and print another edition. And so it's out of print again right now. But people are begging for copies. In fact, they sell copies on the Internet for very large sums because it's the only book.
What is the World Order?
The World Order is a conglomeration of people who agree on the same goals, and they run the world.
So it's a conspiracy of
bankers and politicians and political leaders, and it's mostly it's what is loosely known as capitalists. And a capitalist is not a person who makes capital, he's a person that has capital, and he can make investments. That's what a capitalist is. And he makes investments that make money, more money. And that's all capitalism is. You invest in things that make more money than you have already. So when H.L. Hunt was the richest man in the world, he was buying whole radio networks. In fact, I helped him set up a television network. And he was going to have his own television network. At that time, there were still 3 networks. And he was going to set up a 4th because he had so much money that there was no problem for him at all to set up a television network. And it's a good thing for him he didn't do it because he would have been murdered if he had started his own television network. He wouldn't have lived 6 months because that is real power. They didn't care how much money he made, that he was the richest man in the world. But it's when you take over the levers of power that you become dangerous. And when he had his own television network, he could have ruled the whole world. So he would have been killed, there's no question about it.
Why is it that people don't seem to care?
Well, in the 1930s, scientists wondered how Hitler could rule Germany and Stalin could rule Russia. These were vast territories. He could rule with practically no army. And the answer was they had discovered during the 1920s that adding sodium fluoride to the drinking water made the people very passive. Stalin found out that in his concentration camps, where you have to have guards, I mean nobody's there because they want to be, that by adding sodium fluoride to the drinking water to camps, or the gulags, he could reduce his guards by an average of 4. You only need 1 in 4, 25% instead of 100%, which comes to quite a bit of money. Sodium fluoride is a byproduct of the manufacture of aluminum, which is a very complicated, well, you have it in Florida. It's a very complicated manufacturing process, and a byproduct of the manufacture of aluminum is sodium fluoride, which is a very dangerous chemical and is very expensive to dispose of. So somebody came up with the imaginative premise that maybe sodium fluoride could be used to add to water, and maybe it would help prevent cavities in children in their teeth. There was never any study conducted on this, and no proof whatsoever that this was true. But Congress, with the judicious application of bribes, passed a bill enacting sodium fluoride addition to water supplies all over the United States. And we have had a revolution since. And we had one-party government ever since.
Why did America get involved in World War II?
Well, it was inevitable because World War II was simply a rerun of World War I, exactly the same cast of characters. And in fact, it was the same person, Colonel Mandel House, whose father was a Rothschild agent during the Civil War. And the senior House managed to have runners, privateers, bring cotton from the South to the British mills so that they could operate during the Civil War. So he made a lot of money, of course. And at the end of the Civil War, Colonel House was the only person in the state of Texas who had any money. So he took over the entire Democratic Party in the southern states, which were occupied territory, and still are. You still have two political parties in the South. They're called the carpetbaggers and the scalawags. The carpetbaggers are the Republicans, and the scalawags are the Democrats. And you have exactly the same government that you have had in martial law in 1865, with the same people running everything. It's a perfect setup because everybody knows each other, everybody agrees with each other. There hasn't been a political contest in any southern state since 1865.
Is there a difference between carpetbaggers and scallywags?
Well, there is a difference. The difference is in the name. One group calls themselves Republicans, and the other calls Democrats. The Republicans are not Republicans, and the Democrats are not Democrats. As I say, they're carpetbaggers and scalawags, but they're not known. The press doesn't use those terms because it's offensive to some people. Some people would be offended by that.
Was the United States ever really a true republic?
I don't know that we were. I really do not. Because the people who rewrote the... we started off with the Articles of Confederation. See, that's where the Confederacy comes from. Because when the southern states seceded from the Union, they were exercising the prerogative which they had been given during the Articles of Confederation to secede at any time. You see, the Articles of Confederation gave every state complete autonomy over its own power, over its own people. And so the southern states in 1860 decided to secede from the Union, which they had a perfect right to do. But in 1787, they rewrote the Articles of Confederation, and it was actually a secret convention of Masons in Philadelphia, and they rewrote the Constitution to create a federal government, mainly for the borrowing power. The bankers wanted a country which could have a borrowing power and which could pay back the money. And that was not possible under the Articles of Confederation. The United States colonies, when they won the American Revolution, they set up a governing document called the Articles of Confederation of the United States of America. And that was our sole constitution. But then these Masons got together in 1787 and said, we need a instrument of federal power, and we need an instrument able to borrow money and repay it. And that's why they rewrote the Articles of Confederation, and that's why they did it in secret, because they didn't dare tell anybody that that's what they wanted to do, to set up a dictatorial federal power which the Supreme Court was invented to maintain federal power. The Supreme Court always says that the rule of law is the United States. Well, the rule of law is simply the rule of bandits who will control the United States. That is the rule of law. And if you violate that law, you'll be killed.
Where are the Articles of Confederation located?
No, the Articles of Confederation, I have never seen a copy of it. It's hidden somewhere if any copies exist.
Who wrote the federal government has no power over any citizen of the United States?
That's for me. I'm the only one who said that.
What is that? Where did that come from?
Well, that's the betrayal of the Constitution. That's my latest book, the last book I wrote. And I simply said in there that the general welfare of the United States, the Supreme Court passed his Social Security bill and all of his other bills under false premise that the general welfare of the United States provides for this. Well, what it actually says is that the government shall provide for the general welfare of the United States, which upheld the original Articles of Confederation, which said that each state has complete autonomy. And therefore, the bill for the general welfare of the United States is the bill upholding the Articles of Confederation. But they perverted that the Constitution says that you have to uphold the general welfare of the states, which is what it says. And all of the government programs for citizens are totally illegal because only a state has the power over a citizen. The Washington government has no power. The Washington government is in the seat of government, which is Washington, D.C., and it only has authority in the 24 square miles of the District of Columbia. It has no power on any state in the United States. That is why Governor George Wallace of Alabama threatened to arrest FBI agents who were creating revolution in the state of Alabama, which he had every legal right to do as a governor of the state of Alabama, because Washington had no power to send an FBI agent into the state of Alabama without Governor George Wallace's permission, which they didn't have.
Is the dictatorship of the federal government the reason George W. Bush is in office today?
Oh, yes. That was simply a plebiscite, actually, just like Hitler had in Germany in 19... In fact, the Bush family has very deep ties to Nazi Germany. Oh, yes. Well, in fact, the United States government in Washington has carried out many of Hitler's policies, which he was unable to do because he didn't rule long enough. He had on his plans to bomb the nation of Yugoslavia before he attacked Russia, because he knew that he had to knock off the Slavic population in Yugoslavia before he would be able to attack Russia. And so he launched an attack against Yugoslavia, and time ran out on him on June 4th, 1944, when he attacked, on June 42 it may have been, when he attacked Russia. He had to attack then, although he had not yet subdued Yugoslavia. And so a loyal Nazi named President Bill Clinton finally carried out Hitler's plan of attacking Yugoslavia, and they bombed it into oblivion. That was carrying out the original Nazi program. Because certainly the people of Arkansas, where Clinton was from, had no interest in bombing Yugoslavia. And I could give you many parallels of government action in the last 25 years, which is carrying out the policies of Adolf Hitler.
Who financed Hitler's war?
A good friend of mine, Tony Sutton, wrote a book called Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, and he wrote a second book called Wall Street and the Rise of Bolshevism, which are out of print now. Tony's dead. But the books are absolutely authentic, and he absolutely proves that every step of Nazism was financed by Wall Street bankers, and every step of communism was financed by Wall Street bankers.
And the Wall Street bankers are tied into international moneylenders?
Well, they're tied into the consortium of central bankers of the entire world. the Bank of Italy, the Bank of Japan. And so, well, these are people who've learned to work together, so they do very well.
How is the Bush family tied into World War II?
Well, I always have to start my lectures on Bush by pointing out that the Bush family itself has no background at all. The Bush family was had worked for the Harriman family, and Jacob Schiff at Kuhn Loeb Company, which I mentioned earlier, he financed John D. Rockefeller in the Standard Oil in New Jersey, which became the world oil monopoly, and he financed the Harriman brothers in the Northern Pacific Railroad, which developed the whole western half of the United States with tremendous property rights along the right-of-way of that railroad, which made it probably the richest corporation in the country. And so the Harrimans, of course, made billions of dollars, and they, as really wealthy people did, they had to have somebody to finance, to handle their money. So they hired a young couple, a young family, the Bush family, who were Wall Street operators. They became their money managers. And that's all they did was manage money for the Harriman family. And so, by the way, Averell Harriman became a world agent for the bankers, and his exploits were memorialized in a series of books by Sinclair Lewis, who was a very popular novelist in the 1930s, about a invented character. He called him Lanny Budd, and this was a very wealthy young man who traveled around the world on a first-hand knowledge of world leaders. He was welcomed into their offices and directed policy for them. And Averell Harriman actually wound up, from 1942 to 1944, Stalin had had a nervous breakdown when Hitler invaded Germany, and they had to send Averell Harriman as the world agent of the world bankers to Moscow as ostensibly as U.S. ambassador, and he went into Russia and was the actual dictator of Russia from 1942 to 1944, because Stalin was totally immobilized by his nervous breakdown. And so the whole World War II would have collapsed if Averell Harriman hadn't gone in and kept it going by running Russia from behind the scenes. And of course, at that time, Russia was fighting Nazi Germany. So theoretically, Averell Harriman and the United States were Nazi Germany's biggest enemies. And finally, the Russian army didn't sweep through Germany and conquer Hitler, but that was done through Averell Harriman. There was nothing that Stalin accomplished whatsoever, but nobody knows that. But this is the connection of the Harrimans with Hitler. They actually defeated Hitler, but what they did, they laid Germany waste and it became an American colony, our colony of the world bankers. It has been occupied territory ever since. Both Germany and Italy, Germany and Japan, have been totally occupied countries since 1945.
Can you talk about your book, The $5 Trillion Cold War Hoax?
Well, the $5 trillion Cold War hoax was exposed by Norman Podhoretz, who's one of the big Zionist propagandists in the United States. He was the editor of Commentary in New York City of the American Jewish Committee, which was the unofficial Bible of world Zionism. Commentary carried very serious articles by respected writers on economic and political things. It was like the Foreign Relations, Council on Foreign Relations publication, Foreign Affairs. These were the Bibles of people in the State Department and in Congress to read. They had to read these articles to know what was to do. And that's how they got their instructions. And so anyway, Norman Podhoretz published his autobiography a few years after the Cold War, and he stated in his autobiography, which was for the elite, of course, the average person would never read it, he stated quite frankly that the only purpose of the Cold War was to arm Israel to fight the Arab nations. We're in Iraq today because Podhoretz armed Israel in the 1940s, 50s. See, all this came out of the Paris Peace Conference at Versailles in 1919. There's a book called 1919, Paris and Versailles. And that's a very important book. It tells you everything that was done at the Versailles Peace Conference. And one of the main things was a very vigorous Zionist conference at the World Peace Conference in 1919. And the Zionists got everything they wanted, including Woodrow Wilson, who was a very ardent Zionist himself. So he put Brandeis, who was the head of the World Zionist Organization, which was a very powerful position, he put him on the Supreme Court of the United States. And that's when Wilson put Brandeis on the Supreme Court, that is when the Supreme Court became the operating instrument of the world conspiracy right there. And it's been that ever since. And that's why they voted to put George Bush in the presidency, because they'll do anything that they're told to do.
Could George Bush be indicted for war crimes?
It's more or less disinformation. There is no indictment. There is no indictment going to be handed down. And all of these things are simply making George Bush more secure in office. He's almost ready to become president for life because there's no opposition whatsoever. The Democrats have been totally shattered. They have not a single candidate, and I don't know what they're going to do. And the Republicans don't even have a candidate. They're talking about McCain, who's the biggest phony in the United States. He's married to a mafia princess in Arizona, and he's rolling in money, and he has all the prestige in the world, and he has 100% media cooperation. You would think he's Frank Sinatra, because the media swoons every time McCain appears anywhere.
Could Zionists make George Bush a so-called leader for life?
Well, I think it could happen very easily, because we've elected puppets ever since 1900, when the bankers really took control. Well, he's got advisors who could change that very easily and then could know exactly how to do it. There's certainly certain regulations you'd have to follow, and you can make him president for life. Don't forget, Napoleon made himself emperor for life. Napoleon was a complete nobody. You got to remember that the American people are drinking fluoridated water every day, so they can't object to anything. It's very easy to do, because 9/11 was a step in the right direction, and they can repeat 9/11 at any time, like the Murray Building bombing in Oklahoma City, and the Waco Holocaust of burning a church, an entire church congregation alive in their own church, which Hitler never did in his worst years, but we welcomed it in this country. The CIA will support any dissident group, no matter how far out you are. If I had started a religious group or a political group at any time during the last 50 years of my career, I would have immediately gotten CIA support.
What do you mean support?
Financial support and political support. You'd be allowed to operate. And the FBI would not come in and shut you down tomorrow morning, because that is only done by orders from Washington. Well, they like to have fringe groups all over the country of any persuasion. They really don't care what you believe or what you do, as long as you do something. They're used to manipulate the population, because some people are going to be very enthusiastic about whatever goofy thing these people espouse, and other people are going to be fiercely opposed to it. So right away you've got opposition and conflict right away, which is just handed to you on a silver platter. You don't have to do anything. All you do is turn these people loose and have them attack each other, and you've got a war on your hands.
Do you think the Zionists are planning a war in the United States?
Oh, yes. Well, what I think that they're having problems right now, because the fluoridation of the water and the medical establishment has made the children in schools so passive, and the working people so passive that they don't object to anything. They didn't even, there was no opposition at all to going to war in Iraq, which was the flimsiest thing we've ever done in the history of this country, because Saddam Hussein had never fired a shot in this country, and he had never posed any threat to the United States of America. There was not one American in the United States who was afraid of Saddam Hussein. And our army goes marching into Iraq and pulls down his statues and throws him into prison. And they have a problem with trying him, which is that he had been a loyal asset of the CIA for 40 years. And it's hard to get rid of one of your most faithful officials over a number of years. He didn't just appear on the scene 2 years ago. He's got a 40-year history with the CIA, which most of the employees don't even have.
I mean, what's it all about?
Well, all of the foreign policy organizations in the world, at the end of World War I, the Rothschilds organized a number of groups called, one was the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. It's called Chatham House. And that is the think tank of all of Europe today. And although its headquarters in London, the real headquarters are in Brussels, which is the headquarters of the Lambert family, which is part of the Rothschild family. And Brussels has been running the world since, we had an ambassador to NATO for many years, because NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was headquartered in Brussels. And of course, there was no coincidence that it was headquartered in Brussels, the headquarters of the Lambert family, which is part of the Rothschild family. It was simply a family company.
Who do international bankers support for their control?
NATO and the Council on Foreign Relations and the Royal Institute of International Affairs are all very heavily financed. And if you become affiliated with them in some minor capacity, you'll have an annual salary of, say, $100,000, unlimited expense account to travel around the world on missions and stay at the most expensive hotels, and charge accounts at the most expensive shops to buy your clothes and so forth. And in other words, you become part of the international elite, and you live like a millionaire. Whether you have a dime of your own or not, it doesn't matter. And they will pay all these expenses until you make one mistake. If you give one wrong interview or say the wrong thing publicly, why, your history, that's your last day. And no one will ever hear of you again. And that happens quite frequently.
What do the corporate bankers have to hide?
What they've got to hide is their affiliation and control of all these foreign policy organizations. See, we have the Foreign Policy Institute and Foreign Affairs, the think tank magazine of the World Policy Organization. And all these are very expensive operations. And so they're all run by very trusted and faithful employees, and they do their job every day. They're at the office every day. They don't run out on you. They don't rat on you or anything. They're dependable. And they have that job for as long as they live, and they know that. So they do their jobs, and they do whatever they're told. And it doesn't matter how goofy it is. You can do something as goofy as invading Iraq on the basis of information about WMDs that do not exist, weapons of mass destruction, and get away with it, because these people are accustomed to doing really goofy things that nobody in their right mind would believe in 1 minute. And they're very serious about it, and they have the background. They are people like president of Harvard University or president of Yale University, or they use a lot of corporate presidents, like the Aluminum Company of America president, and people like that, General Motors president, who have stature, and they can do or say anything, and nobody challenges them whatsoever. And that's what reputations are for. They're for people they can use. For instance, I've been a world-known author for 50 years, and yet my name is almost completely unknown, except it's all over the Internet, because on the Internet they have no control. But in the world media, on television, you'll never see me on television, because I've told people repeatedly that when you see anybody's face appear on your television, that means that that person is totally safe and totally owned by the establishment.
Who controls the United States government today?
Well, it's a conglomerate of various criminal enterprises. There are many criminal enterprises in the United States. Some are quite large and some are quite small. But
the government a criminal enterprise?
always a criminal enterprise, because the elections are completely staged and manipulated from the beginning to the end. The candidates are chosen through a very careful process of someone who will thoroughly agree with anything they want to do, foreign policy and economic policy. There are two ways you govern a country. That's through economic policy and foreign policy.
Is the Federal Reserve controlled by the Bank of England?
Oh, yes, it is. I say that in my book. The subtitle of my book, Secrets of the Federal Reserve, is The London Connection, in which I prove conclusively that London still runs the United States. See, London is still the world market of the world bankers. Not Washington, not New York, and not Tokyo, and not Berlin, but it's London.
What's the main mission of the international moneylenders?
Well, my book, The World Order, goes into that quite extensively, which unfortunately is out of print. But I found out when I wrote that book that the main mission of the banks was to start wars. And I found out also that it's very difficult to start a war. If you want to start a war with Iraq, go out and try to do it. It's very tough. And it takes years of hard work. So Bush had a great advantage because his father was head of the Central Intelligence Agency and a worldwide drug distribution operation. So he had plenty of money and plenty of political influence. He had no problem at all to walk into Iraq, although Iraq had never fired a shot at the United States. You see, you declare war on another country when they invade your country and try to take your territory, or there has to be some very good reason to have a war, because you can understand that it's very difficult to get millions of people to run out and kill each other when they have absolutely no bone of contention whatsoever. In fact, all the wars have had... See, that's why Ezra got into this entire thing, and that's how he got me into it. He was living in Paris during World War I, and he had many young writers and artist friends who were drafted into the armies, and some were for Germany and some were for France, and they were killed. And he couldn't understand how these great talents, very brilliant young men, died for nothing. And when he spent years of studying the situation in 8 languages all over Europe, he found out that bankers make wars to create debt. And that's the only reason. And that's the only reason. We went to war against Germany in World War I and World War II at a time when by census, 52% of the population of the United States was of German origin. So this is like a civil war. In fact, the Constitutional Convention failed by 1 vote to make German the official language of the United States in 1780, because it missed by 1 vote, because the predominant population of the country was German. Although it was settled by the English and the French, the English and the French were both too aristocratic to go and live in the desert, a wild country like the United States. And so when Rothschild hired the Hessian troops to battle the American colonists, who were English colonists, and King George III realized that the American colonists would not fight against their British brothers, who were troops from George III from England. And so he had to go to Germany and hire the Hessian troops, who were mercenary troops. And the payment for that rent of these troops became Rothschild was the agent for that. That was his first start towards world power. He made so much money out of the Hessian troops. So there was another consequence. All of these German troops declined to return to Germany, because they had a whole continent here that they had their pick of. Why should they go back to Germany, where every inch of land was owned by somebody already, and you could only get it if you bought it, and it was very expensive. And they could stay in the United States and have 1,000 acres of very good land for nothing. So of course they all stayed. I mean, you can't beat a bargain like that anywhere.
Does Israel control the foreign policy of the United States?
Israel completely controls the United States. In fact, Ariel Sharon, the president of Israel, has said that repeatedly publicly. It's very seldom picked up by the press. But he says the United States will do anything we tell them to. Not ask them to, but tell them to. When Zionism was first proposed in the early 1920s, you see, during World War I, they got the Balfour Declaration for a national home for Israel, and that was pushed through the British Parliament by Lord Rothschild. And because it was such a raw deal, because nobody in the world wanted a national home for the Jews, particularly the Jews, because they lived very well as a parasitic people all over the world, and they didn't particularly look forward to the idea of being confined to one country, which of course they never have done. And so most of your prominent Jews, including Jacob Schiff of Kuhn Loeb Company, who bankrolled the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, Jacob Schiff from 1920 to 1926 was an outspoken anti-Zionist. He believed that it would be suicidal for the Jewish people to have a national home, which of course they would have to be loyal to, as opposed to the freedom that they enjoyed, which was to be a citizen of every nation in the world, which was ideal for what they wanted to do.
Can Zionists destroy the world?
The Zionists have brought the world to the brink of total destruction, economic and natural resources and everything else. You see the skyrocketing price of oil and the skyrocketing price of real estate in the United States. This is a activity which can't go on at this pace long in a few weeks more, and everything's going to totally collapse. So wiser heads, of which are very few, realize that you can't keep going like this. But the bankers and the people who are making the money wanted to keep going like this, because when you're making trillions of dollars, you don't want to quit. It's an addiction. And so they'll keep letting this go on a few more months and see what turns up. There is a revolution going on in the world today, which is actually the world turning. As the world turns, it goes to a certain phase and another phase and another phase. And that's where we are now. Everything is changing, but we can't see it because it's not a day-to-day change. But there is, well, the Internet was one example, because under the Internet, people like myself, which have all media totally closed, television, newspapers, and yet I've become a internationally known writer just by doing it myself. It can be done. So things are not static. Things are less static than they've ever been. And I look for, right now, you see you have a new generation coming up every 20 years. And that new generation wants to make itself felt. They want to make its presence known. And so every 20 years you're facing an utter revolution, because the 20-year generation, many of them from wealthy families, are from prominent families, and have some stature in themselves, and many others are totally penniless and have no background whatsoever. But they create a place for themselves. I started my own publishing company because they told me on Wall Street that they couldn't print my book because the banks would close them down on Monday morning. So I found a child psychologist who would publish my Federal Reserve book. So it can be done. And the publishing media and communications are advancing at a very breathless rate. So you don't know what they're coming up with in the next 6 months. Don't forget they put a bill through Congress to control the Internet, and it was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court because it was totally unconstitutional. There was no justification for it forever. The Supreme Court represents the occupation government, because the government is always an occupation government representing somebody else. The government does not represent the American people, because a democracy is supposed to be representative government. Now, Washington today does not represent any American, except in a very tenuous way.
Was 9/11 an inside job?
100%. What I called it publicly, I was quoted in the New York Times after 9/11, I said it's a typical government operation. And I don't know anybody that said it better. And that appeared in the New York Times in the Frank Rich column, and Frank Rich printed it, but he didn't offer any rebuttal.
Is it a United States government job, or is it a Zionist inside job?
Well, it's more a Zionist inside job,
Okay.
because the Zionism is the government in Washington. Everybody knows that.
So the United States government is controlled by Zionists.
Yes. Well, in Congress, have you ever heard any congressman stand up and make a speech denouncing Israel? Well, you won't.
With that said, and these bankers know that, their time could be limited, no
Yeah.
matter how much money they got, what would they be capable of doing?
Well, right now they're capable of staying on top of the current, and they have enough money to buy into anything they want to. So they're trying to keep control. But of course, they have no control over the Internet. Anything can come on the Internet. And so they're just trying to ride it out. And the Protocols of the Elders of Zion are a very debated document which appeared in the 19th century. And supposedly it's a program by which the Zionists were going to take over the world. The techniques that they would use to do this by controlling communications and education and governments and so forth. And it's a very detailed program for exercising power. And so this document was immediately denounced, and the Zionists denied that it ever existed and so forth. But it was finally brought before a court in Basel, Switzerland, and a judge ruled that the Elders of Protocol of Zion was a forgery. And of course, a forgery is an illegitimate copy, an unauthorized copy of a real document. So the judge's ruling that the Protocols of Elders of Zion was a forgery established that there was a real document somewhere called the Elders of Protocols of Zion, although none was produced. And so ever since then, whenever you mention the Elders of Protocols of Zion, they say, well, that was ruled a forgery by the court in Switzerland. And it was ruled a forgery, which meant that it was a copy of a document that it existed somewhere. I mean, when you forge a check for $100, there has to be an original check somewhere for $100 that you forged. So the Elders of Protocols of Zion is the same thing. The fact that the court ruled that there was such a document meant that there is such a document somewhere and is eventually produced. Henry Ford was the most famous publisher of the Elders of Protocols of Zion, although it's been published in millions of copies ever since 1870. And the reason that Henry Ford published this, as you know, he was an automobile maker, and the fact is he was a very successful manufacturer of automobiles, and because he was so successful, he became the richest man in the world in 1927. The New York Times named him as the richest man in the world. Well, as the richest man in the world, he became fair game, so bankers set about trying to buy control of his stock and control of his company. And he needed capital to expand. He was expanding so rapidly, he needed a lot of capital. He needed hundreds of millions of dollars to keep his motor car company going or to sell it to somebody else. So he tried to borrow the money from Kuhn-Loeb and the Wall Street bankers, and they told him they'd be glad to lend him the money, but they wanted controlling interest. In other words, he had to give away the company. It would no longer be his. So he was very indignant about that because he was a Michigan farmer, and he didn't like being robbed. And so he began to publish articles about these Jewish bankers that tried to rob him. And he made a crusade out of it. He launched a newspaper called the International Jew, which became a series of books, which I think were 9 volumes, which told the background of the Jews as white slavers. They were very active in slavery. They brought slavery to America. And their adventures in alcohol. They were behind the, after Prohibition, they became the biggest liquor manufacturers in the world. Most of it was cheap whiskey, which was cut with raw alcohol, which blinded hundreds of people and killed many thousands more. And it was typical of their operations because killing people wholesale seems to be a get-rich-quick idea that if you can kill thousands of people, you're going to be very rich. My friend Ernst Zundel is in prison today in Germany. He's finally been charged after about 8 years of being in prison before they ever leveled a charge against him. And so the charge is inciting racial hatred. And Ernst Zundel has never been a member of any group which incites racial hatred. So he'll probably never be tried because that's what happened to Ezra Pound. He was imprisoned in St. Elizabeth's under a capital charge of treason, punishable by the death penalty, but they never dared try him because when they called him in and said, Dr. Pound, because he was a doctor of letters from Hamilton College, how do you plan to defend yourselves on these charges? And Ezra said to them, I will stand behind everything that I've ever publicly uttered on politics. And they were devastated because he had too big a reputation, a worldwide reputation, to be tried when he would demolish every argument they came up with. So they got 3 government psychiatrists to testify that he was incompetent to participate in his own defense because he said he had stand by everything he had said. So these psychiatrists said he was incompetent to participate in his own defense, and they held him in prison for 13.5 years, and I was told on Capitol Hill that he would never be released in his lifetime. I was told that by General Lucius Clay and by Supreme Court Justice Tom Clark and 2 other leading officials in Washington, because I had personal connections with him, and I didn't talk to them myself, but George Simpson, the founder of National Press Club, said, well, I'll ask around about Ezra what his chances are. And he came back and reported to me that they all said he will never be released from St. Elizabeth in his lifetime. And 8 years later, the government dropped all charges against him, and he walked out a free man.
Why was Ernest Zundel deported?
Well, he was a Holocaust denier. They've called me a Holocaust denier also, although I have never denied there was a Holocaust because I've never even admitted there was one. So
Do you think there was?
Well, there was no Holocaust. You see, Hitler, now I'm the only person that apparently knows this, and I speak about it very freely. In the waning wars of World War II, when the Allies started to bomb Germany very heavily, Hitler moved all of the Jews out of German cities into rural areas in these camps. And so no Jew died during the Allied bombing of Germany. And that was he was holding them as a bargaining tool because he knew he was going to lose the war, so he could negotiate the terms of surrender by the fact that he had saved the Jews from extermination. So now he's known for the fact that he exterminated the Jews.
So the Zionists flipped all this around
Oh, they flip everything around.
in their favor.
For the name hate monger, which they've called me many times, and a hate monger is a person who criticizes Israel. That's all that matters. That's the only definition of a hate monger.
Is there a difference between a Jew and an Israeli?
Oh, no. Because the Jews are the occupants of Israeli. Although the Palestinians lived there, it was originally their land, but they were dispossessed, and so they're not considered as existing. Palestinians have no rights according to Israel.
I think according to Israel, nobody has rights but Jews.
Well, they have a perfect claim because they say God gave them a real estate deed to the property. and which they refuse to show anybody, but it's considered valid.
Are the Jews God's chosen people?
Well, that occurs in the Old Testament. I don't know how often, but the Old Testament also contains many pages of denunciations of the Jews by the God and threats to punish them for their transgressions. It's about 50-50. There's more verbiage in the Old Testament of God denouncing the Jews and threatening the Jews than there is of calling them as chosen people.
Well, what's the difference between a Christian and a Jew?
Theoretically, biologically, we're the same people. We're human beings. Well, the Jewish people, according to my book, The New History of the Jews, the Hebrews got their name from Habiru, Habiru. And Habiru meant bandits in the Old Testament. So these people were known as bandits all over the Middle East. But the Jews have their own book, which is called the Talmud. And in the Talmud, which is the Jewish Bible, they continually denounce Mary as a whore and a prostitute, and Jesus as a madman, and sometimes as a homosexual. And so it's totally anti-Christian. But they've never bothered to explain any of these accusations. But they're rabbis studying this for all their lives, so they apparently conclude that it's absolutely true, and there's no apology for using those terms. And of course, 1 billion Christians who have some belief in Christianity resent this very much about Mary and Jesus being all these foul names. So this is done simply to keep passion stirred up between the various religions.
Is the CIA controlled by Zionists?
Well, my book, The World Order, has the only history of the CIA. I went through at least 6 histories of the CIA, which are between 800 and 1,000 pages apiece. And from that, I got the entire history of the CIA. And I have it all in 10 pages in my book, The World Order. I'm sorry I don't have one with me. But as I say, this so-called friend carried off a copy about a month ago. I told him, I said, this is my print copy. I got to reprint this book. And he said, I'll get it back to you in a week. And I haven't heard from him in 3 weeks.
Tell me about that. How does that start in your book, and where does it go?
Well, I give the entire history of the CIA, which was formed in 1940 in London by the British General Staff. And the chief architect of the CIA, which was established as a branch of the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS of England, which was established by the Bank of England in 1694 and became the best intelligence service in the United States because it had unlimited funds because that was financed by the Bank of England. It was simply a private intelligence agency for the Bank of England, just like the FBI is a private intelligence agency of the Federal Reserve System. When they had the Ruby Ridge Massacre in Idaho, I was traveling there and lecturing at that time. And so I did a talk show, and there was a young interviewer who was asking me about this, and I said, he said, well, what about all these police units that are attacking Ruby Ridge? And I said, those police units are all Federal Reserve police units. And he said, there's no such thing as a Federal Reserve police. And I said, they're all Federal Reserve police. Who do you think pays them? And he cut me off. It's the only time I've ever been cut off on a talk show in my life. The thing went dead.
Do you think people just don't want to know, or they just think, or what?
Well, when you tell them the real facts, they don't want to admit it. And so the only thing is to hang up the phone.
Or attack you.
And, well, they do that constantly. Whenever your name, once they hang up on you, whenever your name is mentioned, if somebody says, why don't you have Eustace Mullins on? They say, listen, I had him on ad nut on this program, and he practically wrecked my whole program. And that's true. I've taken 50 talk shows hosts off the air in the last 50 years. Never with any intention to do so, but I would say more on the air than they wanted their audiences to hear. And so they would close down the show rather than risk having somebody like me appear on the program again.
Is Mossad connected to the CIA?
It's part of the same operation. In fact, Mossad is generally credited with being totally behind 9/11, and that was a Mossad operation, that they had a squad of Mossad people on hand at the time it happened. And the New York Times and the New York Times and the New York Post both printed stories after 9/11 that 85% of the Muslim world believed that it was a Mossad operation. Well, when 85% of people believe anything, it's worth noticing. But the New York Times printed this to show how insane the Muslims are. And it kind of backfired. It gave legitimacy to what they were saying. Well, if you said that 85% of the people in the United States believe something, then you would have to pay attention to that. And in fact, most all government programs of the last 50 years have been openly opposed by 85% to 89% of the American people. So what do we have except an occupation government? Because when we have a government which is approved by 10% of the people, something is wrong.
You said that the Zionists were on hand during 9/11. Where were they?
They were in the buildings around there. They were directing operations, and they were filming, and they were recording, because they wanted a record of this situation. And so there are many stories, pictures of the buildings being hit by these airplanes, which people have never seen those pictures because they're concealed. But they'll tell you a lot more what actually happened if you're able to see those pictures.
So why do you suppose that Israel wanted to take out the World Trade Centers?
Well, Larry Silverstein bought the World Trade Center, biggest office buildings in the world. He bought it in July, a couple of months before this operation. And it was heavily insured. And, of course, when he just bought it, he just made a down payment. So he owed most of the money on it. So when the buildings were collapsed by demolition, which is the only way a building can come down like that, is controlled demolition. Because you can't knock down a 100-story building just by wishing it away. You have to it takes about 3 months to plan all the electronics and the demolition. And so this, at 9/11, the buildings sank gracefully, the way they do under any standard demolition operation that you've ever seen.
What's the point? What was the point in them taking the building down?
Well, it changed the world. That was the point.
How so?
Well, the papers said that our world has changed forever and never be the same, which is a very remarkable goal. Just by blowing up 2 office buildings, you change the world.
What did they get out of it?
Well, they got, first of all, national panic. Second, total government control. And the war on terror, which will go on forever, because we're going to be terrified forever. So there'll always be terror. Terror is the most wonderful thing. I wrote an article, which is on my website, called The Necessity for State Terrorism, in which I conducted an imaginary interview with Joseph Stalin, in which he explained why state terrorism was necessary. And, the Bolsheviks, for 70 years, they killed an average of 1 million people a year, which is 70 million people. And that was done without a peep from anybody. Nobody has ever been charged with a single murder. You can kill 1 million people a year, and there's no blame attached to anybody. Look at this last attack in London. They put a little bomb and a little...
Who did?
Well, I don't know. Supposedly Muslims did. But it looks like a standard Mossad operation, because I don't know why any Muslims wants to bomb the London subways, because they ride it to work every day.
Okay, so Israel attacked the United States on 9/11.
Yes.
And they got Iraqi oil.
Yeah.
They got they're going to have Iran oil.
Yes.
They're going to have Syrian oil.
And Saudi Arabia.
And we kind of got that now, but in a kind of roundabout way.
Well, Saudi Arabia apparently has been playing a double game all the way, because the Saudi princes have always banked their money in Switzerland, apparently with Jewish banks. So the so-called Saudi billions are apparently completely controlled in Switzerland by Jewish bankers. The central bank mechanism has enabled the Jews to control all the banks of the world, because central banking is just that, centralized banking. That's all central bank means, that it's centralized banking. And if it's centralized, the Jews can come in from anywhere in the world and gain control of it.
So they control through debt.
Yeah, through debt. Well, control through debt means control through unpayable debt. It's debt that can never be paid. The interest will never catch up with the debt itself. So
is that what they did to the United States government, and is that how they're controlling it?
Oh, yes.
So the United States government went and borrowed money for wars, and now it can never be paid back, so they're under the control of the...
Well, that's why you have the big spenders, starting with 1933 with Roosevelt. You had big spenders ever since, because the more spenders you have, the more debt you have, the more interest the banks make. It's a win-win proposition.
For bankers.
For bankers. And it's a ruinous proposition for any nation in the world. As I pointed out, since 1885, the Rothschilds were trying to start a world war, because the Zionist International Congress at Basel, Switzerland, has called for 3 world wars. At the end of the Third World War, they would control the entire world.
At the end of the Third World War?
Which we are now.
Are we in World War III now?
Well, I just filed a court paper in which I pointed out that 1 billion Christians are fighting a war to the death against 1 billion Muslims, which will leave Israel in charge of the world, which was predicted at the 6th International Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland in 1896. They had a speaker there who said, we're going to have three world wars, and in 1896 there had never been a world war. And so after the Zionist Congress in 1896, you had World War I, World War II, and now we have World War III. Jewish people feel like they can be safe only if they control the world, because they have developed a mythology throughout the world that no matter where a Jew goes, he's going to be killed by somebody, and that everybody hates Jews and everybody wants to kill them. Well, you won't find that. In the United States, we have provided a haven for Jewish people from all over the world for 400 years. There's never been a pogrom, which is a Jewish name for attacks against Jews. There's never been a pogrom in the United States in 400 years, yet we have multi-million-dollar organizations like the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, which claim that there's enormous activity, anti-Semitic, throughout the United States, and that Jews are in immediate peril of annihilation here. And this is pure mythology. There's no basis for it whatsoever. But on the basis of this mythology, they raised hundreds of millions of dollars of tax-exempt money in the United States, and the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation both completely back this program of illegal money raising for a fake organization. And they all should be in prison for it.
Well, why do you suppose that Jewish people are so paranoid?
Well, because that's part of their religion. Because from the beginning, in the new history of the Jews, I point out that they have always believed in ritual human sacrifice, and this has caused objections everywhere they've lived. And it's their own practices which bring down retribution on them. It's not because anybody hates Jews. I don't think you hate Jews.
I don't hate Jews at all.
And I don't hate Jews because I have no reason to hate Jews.
Why do they hate us?
Well, because we're in the way.
Of what?
Of their world power. They want world power, and the only way they can the only way they can obtain world power is to get rid of us.
So then we're talking a major war.
Oh yes, eventually. The thing is that when you talk about a major war, you have to realize that most people don't care one way or the other about the Jews. So how could you have a major war about Jews? Well, the answer is they manipulate people, because we've had 2 world wars and we're at World War III at the present time. Well, how did these 3 world wars come about? By manipulation. We marched into the desert in Iraq, which was part of the old Ottoman Empire. There's no such thing as an Arab country, because they were Turkish provinces for many years. And so we were fighting in Iraq for a country that didn't exist before 1919. And that's becoming a major World War III between Muslims and Christians.
Who are the terrorists?
Anyone who opposes Israel is a terrorist. That's where the word originated. We never heard of terrorists 50 years ago.
Who considers you to be an anti-Semite?
The Jewish people consider Ezra Pound and myself as the real anti-Semites. They must be attacked and denounced every time the name is mentioned. When I published the Federal Reserve book in 1953, over 50 years ago, the book was immediately attacked publicly by the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, the same people who got me discharged from the staff of the Library of Congress, the only person ever discharged from the staff of the Library of Congress for political reasons in its entire history, because usually people at the Library of Congress are not politically active, and I was not politically active. I had never voted in an election at the time that I was fired from the Library of Congress. So that shows you what an activist I am.
Do you think that they are going to stage another 9/11 event?
Oh, they almost have to. It has to be something further. I've said for a year, at least a year, that they've got to have another 9/11. And I don't know what they're going to do.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at some ideas about global power structures, particularly in banking and international relations. You know, the kind of stuff that really makes you think.
Yeah, the stuff that keeps you up at night.
Exactly. And we've got some pretty thought-provoking material to unpack today.
Oh, yeah.
A talk by Eustace Mullins. He's an author who's well known for, let's just say, shaken things up a bit with his views on these topics.
That's one way to put it.
Maybe a little diplomatic.
Yeah. Mullins' work, it's definitely controversial.
Definitely.
And he's attracted a lot of criticism over the years. But, you know, even though his ideas might be considered a bit out there, outside the mainstream, it's still helpful to, you know, try to understand where he's coming from, analyze his arguments, see what, if any, merit they might hold.
Right. It's like, you know, taking a peek behind the curtain, even if what we find there might be a little unsettling.
Yeah, exactly.
So what is Mullins all about?
Well, one of his central arguments is that the Federal Reserve System, the institution that manages our money supply.
Yeah, the Fed.
He claims it's actually, get this, a criminal syndicate.
Whoa.
He says they have this unchecked power to just print money, which, as we know, leads to inflation, prices going up, and basically traps us all in this cycle of never-ending debt.
Okay, so he's saying the Fed is the big bad wolf of our economy.
Pretty much, yeah.
He's also specifically saying the Fed isn't actually federal at all and that it doesn't have any real reserves.
Exactly.
Those are some pretty bold claims.
They are bold. And, to be fair to Mullins, there was a long history of debate surrounding central banks and the power they wield. Now, one thing he claims is that the Federal Reserve was specifically created to finance World War I. That's not quite accurate. The timing's just off.
Okay.
But the relationship between central banks and war finance is something that's been discussed and debated for decades. It's a real thing.
So even if we don't necessarily buy into the whole criminal syndicate idea, there is still some, legitimate questions to be asked about the role and influence of central banks.
Right.
Especially when it comes to financing wars.
Absolutely. It makes you think about the potential impact of these institutions. How might their actions, whether you agree with them or not, affect your own personal finances? Food for thought.
For sure. So we've got the Federal Reserve as a potential puppet master. What else? What else does Mullins have for us?
Well, according to Mullins, the Federal Reserve is just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Okay.
He believes there's this, world order.
World order.
Made up of, bankers, politicians, and secret societies.
Oh, boy.
They're pulling the strings behind the scenes, manipulating global events, all for their own benefit.
Okay, so we're going full conspiracy theory here.
We might be venturing into those waters. He even goes as far as to suggest that the U.S. government itself is basically a corporate banking enterprise controlled by this shadowy group.
So this world order, what's their end game? What are they trying to achieve?
Well, Mullins claims they see dictatorships as the ideal form of government because they can guarantee debt collection through force. And he believes they orchestrate wars and conflicts to further their agenda.
Okay, so essentially he's saying that global events are often driven not by, the best interests of nations or people, but by the selfish desires of this small elite group.
Yeah, that's the gist of it.
Does framing things this way, in terms of these, grand conspiracies, does it actually help us understand these really complex situations, though? Or does it make things too simple?
That's a good question. And it is a tricky one. While it might be tempting to try and simplify things by, pointing to a secret cabal pulling all the strings,
right,
doing so can lead to some pretty harmful generalizations about entire groups of people.
Absolutely.
So it's important to, critically evaluate these claims and look for alternative explanations.
Right. We need to be careful not to fall into that trap of seeing conspiracies everywhere.
For sure.
Now, when we were prepping for this, one of the things that really stood out to me was how Mullins focuses on Zionism and Israel.
Yes. And this is where things get, particularly sensitive.
Yeah.
Mullins argues that Israel exerts a lot of control, a disproportionate amount of control over U.S. foreign policy, and that they're constantly pushing for dominance in the Middle East.
Through military strength?
Exactly.
Okay.
He even goes so far as to claim that conflicts like the Cold War, the Iraq War, and, current tensions with certain countries are all, orchestrated to serve Israel's geopolitical ambitions.
He also claims that 9/11 was orchestrated by Israel to further this agenda, and even suggests that the World Trade Center towers were intentionally demolished through controlled demolition.
Yes, and these are, as you can imagine, very controversial claims.
To say the least.
They deviate quite a bit from generally accepted historical accounts.
It's important to be mindful, especially when dealing with events that have caused so much pain and suffering, to really examine all the evidence and consider all sides of the story, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. We need to approach these sensitive topics with nuance and, a sense of responsibility.
Right. And I think it's also important to reiterate here that, we're presenting these ideas from Mullins, not necessarily endorsing them.
Right.
Part of critical thinking is being willing to consider different perspectives, even if they're challenging, or maybe make us a little uncomfortable.
I agree. But it's equally important to recognize that, not all perspectives are created equal.
Right.
And some can be incredibly harmful.
For sure.
And that's something we need to be mindful of as we, delve deeper into Mullins' worldview.
Okay. So we've talked about the Federal Reserve, this world order, and the influence of Israel. Where else does Mullins take us?
Well, he also gets into what he sees as methods of population control within the U.S. And this is where things get really interesting or strange, depending on how you look at it.
Okay.
This is where his claims about sodium fluoride and mind control come in.
Wait, what? Like our water supply?
Yeah. He argues that adding sodium fluoride to our drinking water, which has been done for decades to improve dental health.
Right.
He says it's actually a sinister plot to make people more passive and easier to manipulate.
So he's saying our tap water is turning us into zombies.
Pretty much, yeah. He claims this, combined with control over, media and education, allows those in power to basically shape public opinion and crush any dissent.
That's a bit out there.
It is.
Is there any truth to that? I mean, does fluoride in our water really make us more susceptible to, government control?
Well, the thing is, numerous scientific studies have actually debunked this claim.
Okay.
The benefits of water fluoridation for dental health are well documented.
Okay.
And there's no credible evidence to suggest it has any effect on people's behavior or thought processes.
Right.
It's important to remember that, anecdotes aren't the same as evidence.
Right. Just because a story sounds intriguing doesn't make it true. So if someone's concerned about fluoride, where should they go to, learn more, get some actual facts?
There's a ton of information available online, reputable sources, I encourage everyone to do their own research and draw their own conclusions.
Good advice. Now, before we go any further, I need to give a bit of a heads up here. We're about to enter some extremely sensitive and, frankly, disturbing territory. This is the part where Mullins denies the occurrence of the Holocaust.
Yeah, and this is where we need to be absolutely clear. Holocaust denial is a very dangerous, deeply offensive form of anti-Semitism that's rooted in distortion of history and outright fabrication.
Mullins goes so far as to call himself a Holocaust denier.
Wow.
Like it's a badge of honor. And he claims that any accusations of anti-Semitism are just a way to silence critics of Israel. He even cites the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as evidence of a Jewish plan for world domination, which, for anyone who doesn't know, has been widely debunked as a forgery.
It's crucial to counter these harmful claims with, the truth. The historical evidence of the Holocaust is overwhelming. The systematic persecution and murder of millions of Jews by the Nazi regime is a horrific historical fact. And any attempt to minimize or deny that is just reprehensible. It's not about suppressing dissenting opinions. It's about combating dangerous falsehoods. Falsehoods that have real-world consequences.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to understand how these types of conspiracy theories, they contribute to the spread of hatred and intolerance. We have a responsibility to challenge misinformation and prejudice wherever we encounter it, especially when it targets vulnerable groups and distorts the truth.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, so picking up where we left off, let's kind of explore how Mullins believes this so-called world order actually operates.
Yeah, and what, motivates them. What's driving all of this according to him?
Well, he really seems to have this pretty, bleak outlook on things, doesn't he?
Yeah, for sure.
He paints this picture of a world that's, ruled by profit and power. Yeah. Agreed, exactly. And he believes that war is actually the most profitable investment.
For these people.
Yeah, for the ones in power. He cites things like, Halliburton benefiting from the Iraq War and Rockefeller increasing oil prices during World War I to illustrate this point.
So he's basically saying that, the desire for profit is what drives these global conflicts and that these shadowy groups are the ones pulling the strings behind the scenes.
That's his argument, yeah.
Wow.
He even claims that the Federal Reserve System, we talked about that,
yeah,
was created by bankers to specifically finance World War I, which, as we discussed earlier, doesn't quite line up with the historical timeline.
Yeah, the dates are a little off there.
Right.
But it does make you think about, the role of finance in wartime.
Yeah.
I mean, wars are incredibly expensive.
Oh, they are. And Mullins argues that these wars are meticulously planned and orchestrated by, secret organizations.
Like who?
He names groups like the Masons,
okay,
the Jesuits, even the Mafia.
Wow, he's really throwing out some big names here.
He is.
So what does he think these, organizations are getting out of all of this? Why are they involved?
He suggests that membership in these groups brings wealth and power.
Okay.
That they serve as instruments for manipulating global events.
Mm-hmm.
But it's worth noting that these are, serious accusations.
Right.
Attributing these complex geopolitical events to these, secretive cabals can be very dangerous. It often leads to scapegoating and fuels prejudice.
For sure. I mean, we have to be so careful about making sweeping judgments about entire groups of people.
Right.
Based on these types of conspiracy theories.
Exactly, and especially when it comes to organizations like the Masons and the Jesuits. I mean, they have long and complex histories.
Yeah.
It's important to separate fact from fiction.
And avoid generalizations.
Absolutely.
Now, aside from these international organizations, Mullins also focuses on methods of controlling the population within the United States, right?
Yes, and this is where his claims about sodium fluoride and mind control come in again.
Oh, yeah.
He really seems to fixate on this.
Yeah.
He argues that the practice of adding fluoride to drinking water, which again is widely recognized for its benefits to dental health, is actually a scheme to make people more passive and easier to control.
It's like he thinks our tap water is turning us all into sheeple.
Yeah, that's basically it.
That's pretty hard to believe.
It is.
But he's adamant about it.
Oh, yeah, he claims that this, along with control over the media and the education system, allows those in power to shape public opinion and just squash any form of dissent.
That's a pretty unsettling thought if it were true.
It is. But as we discussed earlier, these claims about fluoride have been repeatedly debunked by scientific research.
Right.
There's just no evidence to support the idea that fluoride has any mind-altering effects.
And the benefits for dental health are very well established.
Absolutely.
Okay, so another conspiracy theory bites the dust.
Pretty much.
So what else does he point to as evidence of this world order, controlling everything?
Well, he also alleges that the U.S. government is hiding the fact that Fort Knox, where a significant portion of the nation's gold reserves are supposedly held, is actually empty.
Wait, so he's saying all those gold bars we see in pictures and documentaries, they're all fake?
That's his claim, but again, there's no credible evidence to support this. Access to Fort Knox is very tightly controlled, but that's for security reasons.
Right.
Doesn't mean the gold isn't there.
Okay.
Periodic audits are conducted to verify the inventory.
So it seems like Mullins basically believes that the entire system is rigged.
Yeah, from our monetary system to the government itself. He argues that true power lies in controlling finance and information.
Okay.
And that those who hold this power will stop at nothing to maintain their control.
Even resorting to, deception and violence.
Exactly. He even claims that the United States has never been a true republic.
Oh.
And that the Articles of Confederation, which were in place before the Constitution, were intentionally suppressed because they gave too much power to individual states. But that's a misrepresentation of history.
Okay.
The Articles of Confederation were replaced by the Constitution because they proved to be ineffective in creating a strong and unified national government.
Right.
The decision to adopt the Constitution was the result of extensive debate and compromise among the Founding Fathers.
So it seems like he's twisting history to fit his narrative.
Yeah.
What about specific historical events?
Okay.
Does he try to connect them to this world order conspiracy?
He does. For example, he believes that the assassination of President John F. Kennedy was orchestrated by elements within the government who saw Kennedy as a threat to their power.
Right. Of course, there are many different theories about the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah.
And none have been conclusively proven.
Exactly. And it's so important to approach these historical events with a critical eye.
Yeah.
And consider all of the evidence before jumping to conclusions.
For sure, he also claims that the United States intentionally prolonged the Cold War to benefit the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, he cites the massive amounts of money spent on defense during that period as evidence.
Arguing that it all served the interests of those who profit from war.
Yeah, and while it's true that the Cold War had a profound impact on the U.S. economy and led to a massive buildup of military power, attributing it solely to a conspiracy for profit is a gross oversimplification
of a very complex historical period.
Exactly. There were so many factors at play during the Cold War.
Yeah.
And reducing it to a simple conspiracy theory just ignores the nuances and complexities of that era.
So we're seeing a pattern here, right?
Yeah.
Mullins tends to view events through a very specific lens, attributing complex historical and geopolitical situations to the actions of a small, powerful group operating in secret.
That's classic conspiracy thinking. It often relies on connecting seemingly unrelated events and drawing conclusions based on speculation rather than solid evidence.
It can be compelling, though.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially when it's presented by someone like Mullins, you know.
Yeah, very charismatic.
But it's important to maintain a healthy dose of skepticism.
Yeah.
And really think critically about the claims being made.
It's crucial to constantly ask ourselves, what evidence supports these claims? Are there alternative explanations? And what are the potential consequences of accepting these ideas as truth?
Yeah, those are such good questions to keep in mind as we continue to, kind of wade through all of this.
Yeah.
Now, besides describing this, supposed world order, does Mullins offer any solutions? Like, are there ways to resist its control, according to him?
He does. He believes that individuals can resist this control by becoming self-sufficient.
Okay.
And developing their own critical thinking skills. He encourages people to become less reliant on systems and institutions he sees as corrupt.
Like the government and the banking system?
Yeah, and to create alternative communities outside the mainstream.
So he's advocating for a kind of like off-the-grid lifestyle where people grow their own food, barter for goods and services,
right,
and essentially create their own like mini societies.
Yeah, that's the general idea. And while some of these ideas might appeal to people who feel disillusioned with, the current state of affairs, it's important to consider their practicality and potential downsides.
For sure.
It's not always easy to just disconnect from the grid.
Right. And it's worth noting that Mullins' vision of self-sufficiency is often rooted in this like romanticized view of the past.
Yeah.
Which may not be feasible or even desirable for everyone.
And withdrawing from society entirely can sometimes lead to isolation.
Yeah.
And make people more vulnerable to manipulation.
That's a good point. So even in his proposed solutions, there's this kind of tension between like individual agency and the influence of these powerful forces.
It's a theme that runs throughout his work.
Yeah.
And one that resonates with many people today.
Even those who don't, buy into conspiracy theories.
Exactly. The question of how individuals can navigate a world that often feels increasingly complex and controlled is something I think we all grapple with.
Absolutely. All right, so as we wrap up this segment, I want to leave our listener with something to think about.
Okay.
Mullins believes that the, quote-unquote world order uses fear and division as, like, tools of control.
Right.
Do you see any evidence of that in the world today?
That's a good question.
Are there ways in which we're being manipulated through fear?
Yeah.
Or encouraged to view others with suspicion and distrust?
It's definitely something to think about.
It is. It's something to think about as we head into the final part of our deep dive. All right, so, we've been exploring some pretty intense and controversial ideas from Eustace Mullins, and I think it's time to kind of circle back to one of the most, disturbing aspects of his worldview, which is his denial of the Holocaust.
Yeah, this is a point where, we need to be exceptionally clear and firm in our response. Mullins' denial of the Holocaust is not, simply a difference of opinion. It's a very dangerous and deeply offensive form of anti-Semitism. It attempts to rewrite history and diminish the suffering of millions of people.
He tries to, justify his stance, right?
Yeah.
By saying that Hitler moved Jews to camps not to exterminate them, but to protect them from bombings and to use as bargaining chips in negotiations. He even claims that no Jews died in Allied bombings because Hitler had supposedly moved them all to rural areas. I mean, come on.
Right. That's just not true. It's a blatant falsification of history. Yeah. The evidence of the Holocaust is overwhelming.
Yes.
And the systematic nature of the Nazi genocide is irrefutable. There's no room for debate here.
Mullins actually uses the term Holocaust denier like it's some sort of badge of honor.
It's really disturbing.
Yeah, and he claims that accusations of anti-Semitism are just a tactic to silence anyone who criticizes Israel. He even tries to use the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which again is a fabricated document that's been debunked countless times, as proof of a Jewish plot for global domination.
It's so important to understand that Holocaust denial is a form of anti-Semitism.
Yes.
And it seeks to erase this horrific chapter in human history and delegitimize the experiences of survivors and their descendants. It's not about suppressing different opinions. It's about confronting dangerous lies that fuel hatred and prejudice.
It's like saying gravity doesn't exist. You can say it, but it doesn't make it true.
Right.
And the consequences of believing these things and spreading these falsehoods can be incredibly harmful.
Exactly. And we need to be vigilant in challenging these dangerous narratives whenever we encounter them.
Right.
Silence in the face of such bigotry only allows it to spread.
Mullins also claims that Israel deliberately manipulates global events, right, to advance its own interests, and even alleges that the World Trade Center was intentionally demolished on 9/11 as part of this plan.
He suggests that Israel benefits from the chaos and conflict generated by attacks like 9/11, using them to justify expansionist policies and gain international support.
So again, he's painting this picture of a world on the brink of this clash of civilizations, orchestrated by a select few for their own benefit. It's, it's bleak.
It's a very bleak outlook, and these assertions are highly speculative. They rely heavily on conjecture and assumptions, not on credible evidence. There's simply no proof to support the claim that Israel was behind the 9/11 attacks or that the World Trade Center was brought down by controlled demolition.
It's so important to remember that, criticizing the policies of any government, including Israel's, is not the same as making sweeping generalizations and accusations of malicious intent, like those put forth by Mullins.
Right. It's about being specific and focusing on actual policies and actions, not resorting to harmful stereotypes and generalizations.
And we always have to be aware of the harmful stereotypes and prejudices that often underlie these types of conspiracy theories.
Yes. They can have very real and damaging consequences, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've waded through some pretty murky waters exploring Mullins' ideas on, everything from the Federal Reserve to the Holocaust.
And hopefully we're emerging from this with, a sharper sense of critical awareness. The world is full of information, and not everything we hear, even for those who seem like experts or authorities, is true or accurate. We have to be discerning.
Absolutely. So what are some, key takeaways? What can our listeners take away from this whole exploration of Mullins' worldview?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is to, be skeptical.
Okay.
Of any grand narrative that tries to explain complex events as the work of these small, powerful groups pulling all the strings.
Right.
The world is far more nuanced than that.
It's complicated.
It is. And we should always be wary of claims that are based on speculation and assumptions rather than solid evidence. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
And finally, it's absolutely vital to be aware of the dangers of misinformation and the harmful stereotypes that often fuel these conspiracy theories.
Yes.
We have a responsibility to challenge prejudice and bigotry whenever and wherever we encounter it.
So where do we go from here? How can we apply these critical thinking skills to the, constant barrage of information we face in our daily lives?
It's a great question. I think it's about cultivating a healthy sense of skepticism.
Yeah.
Without falling into cynicism. It's about, actively seeking out diverse perspectives and being willing to question our own assumptions.
It's about recognizing that the pursuit of truth is a journey, not a destination.
Ooh, that's good.
And it's a journey we undertake together.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sometimes unsettling world of Eustace Mullins. We hope it's given you some food for thought and encouraged you to keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
Remember, the world is a fascinating and complex place. The more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know. But that's part of what makes it so exciting. There's always more to discover.
More to uncover. So keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going.
Absolutely.
We'll be back next time with another deep dive into the depths of information. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
Eustace Mullins presents The World Order. Summary. The sources consist of an excerpt from a transcription of a lecture by Eustace Mullins, a controversial writer and self-proclaimed expert on the Federal Reserve System. Mullins presents a conspiracy theory that claims international bankers, particularly Jewish bankers, control world events through manipulation of the monetary system, government, and media. He believes the Federal Reserve System, which he calls a criminal syndicate, is a tool for these bankers to start wars, generate debt, and ultimately control the world. He explicitly blames Israel and Zionism for events like 9/11 and alleges a plan for a Jewish world domination through a series of world wars. Mullins' theories are highly controversial and have been widely debunked by historians and economists. The provided text is an excerpt from a transcript of Eustace Mullins discussing his views on the world order. The text is rife with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and dangerous generalizations about Jewish people, promoting harmful stereotypes and misinformation. Central themes. Conspiracy of international bankers. Mullins posits a global conspiracy orchestrated by international money lenders, primarily focusing on the Rothschild family and Jewish bankers. He accuses them of controlling central banks, instigating wars for profit, and aiming for global domination. Federal Reserve as a criminal syndicate. Mullins repeatedly labels the Federal Reserve a criminal syndicate, alleging its creation was a conspiracy to seize control of the U.S. monetary system. He blames the Federal Reserve for inflation, debt, and financing wars. Zionist control of governments and media. He claims that Zionists exert complete control over the U.S. government, manipulating foreign policy to serve Israel's interests. He also accuses them of controlling the media and suppressing dissent. 9/11 as a Mossad operation. Mullins propagates the conspiracy theory that the 9/11 attacks were orchestrated by the Israeli intelligence agency, Mossad, to advance Zionist goals and gain control of oil resources. Justification for anti-Semitism. The text attempts to justify anti-Semitism by portraying Jewish people as inherently parasitic, power-hungry, and prone to ritualistic practices that invite hatred. Dangerous claims and misinformation. Jewish people seeking world domination. The text repeatedly accuses Jewish people and Zionists of aiming for world domination through financial control, wars, and manipulation of governments. This reinforces harmful stereotypes of Jewish people as power-hungry and manipulative. Muslims and Christians at war for Israel's benefit. Mullins claims that the conflict between Muslims and Christians is a calculated strategy by Israel to eliminate its rivals and achieve global dominance. This dangerous generalization incites religious hatred and ignores the complex historical and political factors behind these conflicts. Fluoridation for population control. He promotes the conspiracy theory that water fluoridation is a government plot to pacify the population and prevent dissent, a baseless claim with no scientific evidence. Denial of the Holocaust. Mullins denies the Holocaust, calling it a fabrication by Zionists to manipulate public opinion and advance their goals. This is a blatant distortion of historical facts and minimizes the suffering of millions of victims. It is crucial to recognize this text as a source of dangerous and unfounded conspiracy theories, driven by anti-Semitism and hate speech. The claims made are baseless, lacking evidence, and rely on harmful stereotypes. It is essential to approach such information with critical thinking, verify facts through reliable sources, and reject prejudiced generalizations. FAQ, Eustace Mullins on the World Order. 1. What is the Federal Reserve System, and why is it so controversial? According to Eustace Mullins, the Federal Reserve System is a privately owned central bank that controls the U.S. monetary system. He argues that it's a criminal syndicate that profits from war and manipulates the economy through debt and fiat currency, money not backed by gold or silver. He believes it operates unconstitutionally, usurping Congress's power to control money. He further claims that its creation in 1913 made World War I possible and continues to finance wars for profit. 2. Who is behind the Federal Reserve System and its alleged control over the United States? Mullins claims the Federal Reserve is controlled by international bankers, particularly those based in London, who are connected to powerful families like the Rothschilds and Rockefellers. He argues these individuals exert their influence through organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and secret societies like the Freemasons. He further claims that this world order manipulates governments and economies for its own gain. 3. Does Mullins believe Israel plays a role in this alleged global conspiracy? Mullins asserts that Israel exerts significant control over U.S. foreign policy, citing politicians who allegedly prioritize Israeli interests above American ones. He claims this influence stems from the Zionist movement, which he believes aims for global domination. He further contends that Israel benefits from wars instigated by the world order and cites the Iraq War as an example. 4. What are the alleged goals of this world order, and how do they maintain their control? Mullins argues the world order seeks to consolidate global power and resources. He believes they achieve this through controlling financial institutions, manipulating political systems through staged elections and puppet leaders, and instigating wars for profit. Additionally, he claims they use propaganda and control over media to shape public opinion and suppress dissent. He cites sodium fluoride in water as a means of pacifying the populace. 5. Does Mullins believe the United States was ever truly a republic? Mullins expresses doubt about the U.S. ever being a true republic, suggesting its current form was engineered through a manipulated rewriting of the Articles of Confederation in 1787. He contends this rewriting concentrated power in a federal government controlled by the world order, leaving citizens with limited power and autonomy. He further claims this concentration of power makes the federal government a criminal enterprise operating against the people's interests. 6. What are Mullins' views on the events of 9/11? Mullins claims the 9/11 attacks were orchestrated by Israel's intelligence agency, Mossad, to advance Zionist interests. He cites Larry Silverstein, who allegedly profited from insurance claims after the World Trade Center collapse, and points to controlled demolition as evidence of a planned operation. He further claims this event was used to instill fear and justify the war on terror, which he believes serves the world order's agenda. 7. What does Mullins say about the Holocaust and accusations of anti-Semitism? Mullins denies being a Holocaust denier, but also claims there was no Holocaust. He argues that Hitler moved Jews to concentration camps for negotiation leverage rather than extermination. He further accuses Zionist organizations of exploiting the Holocaust narrative to raise money and silence critics of Israel. He contends accusations of anti-Semitism are weaponized to stifle any opposition to Zionist agendas. 8. What does Mullins propose as a solution to this alleged global conspiracy? While Mullins doesn't explicitly outline solutions, his work emphasizes exposing the alleged truth about the world order's machinations. He suggests empowering individuals through knowledge and encouraging critical thinking against mainstream narratives. He seems to place hope in new generations and the potential for widespread awareness via platforms like the Internet, which he views as less susceptible to control. Understanding Eustace Mullins' claims, a deep dive into anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. This table of contents analyzes excerpts from a transcript of Eustace Mullins, a notorious anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist. It dissects his claims about a Zionist-controlled world order, the Federal Reserve, and various historical events. This document aims to provide insight into the structure and logic of Mullins' arguments. Please remember that the information presented here is based on highly problematic and harmful conspiracy theories. Part 1, The World Order and Zionist Control. The Muslim-Christian War. Mullins claims that Israel orchestrates conflict between Muslims and Christians, aiming for their mutual destruction to secure global dominance. Zionism as the ultimate enemy. He asserts that the State of Israel is a tool of world Zionism, which prioritizes its interests above all else, including the United States. Ezra Pound and the World Order. Mullins positions himself as the last protege of Ezra Pound, highlighting Pound's alleged discovery of a banker-driven war conspiracy. The Federal Reserve as a criminal syndicate. He defines the Federal Reserve as a tool for war financing and speculation, controlled by a select group of banking families. Consequences of Federal Reserve control. Mullins blames the Federal Reserve for fiat currency, inflation, national debt, and economic instability. The Federal Reserve's criminal nature. He argues that the Federal Reserve's existence is unconstitutional and labels its operations a criminal conspiracy. The hidden conspiracy. Mullins justifies his belief in conspiracies by claiming that they are ubiquitous and inherent in all commercial and political activities. Part 2, Historical Manipulation and Control. Congress and the Federal Reserve. Mullins criticizes Congress for relinquishing control over money, contrary to the Constitution, and blames this on the Federal Reserve. The absence of gold in Fort Knox. He asserts that there is no gold backing the US dollar and implies a cover-up regarding the true state of Fort Knox. Fiat currency vs. Gold/silver-backed currency. Mullins criticizes fiat currency for its lack of intrinsic value and contrasts it with gold/silver-backed systems. American settlers and banks. He uses historical anti-bank sentiments among American settlers to bolster his argument against the Federal Reserve. Charles Lindbergh and the Federal Reserve. Mullins cites Charles Lindbergh Sr.'s opposition to the Federal Reserve in 1913 as proof of its corrupt nature. Financing communism and dictatorships. He claims that bankers support communism and dictatorships because these systems ensure debt collection and control. The Iraq War as a profitable investment. Mullins views the Iraq War as an example of war profiteering by companies like Halliburton. The American people's silence. He attributes the public's lack of resistance to the Federal Reserve to a combination of hidden agendas and fluoride in the water supply. Sodium fluoride as a tool of control. Mullins claims that sodium fluoride in drinking water pacifies the population, preventing revolution and dissent. World War II as a rerun of World War I. He argues that both world wars were orchestrated by the same group of international bankers, including the Rothschild family. Part 3, The Bush Family, 9/11, and Zionist Power. The Bush family's origins. Mullins alleges that the Bush family gained wealth by managing money for the Harriman family, who were connected to the Rothschilds. Averell Harriman and World War II. He claims that Averell Harriman, a supposed world agent for bankers, single-handedly orchestrated the Allied victory in World War II. The Cold War as a hoax. Mullins cites Norman Podhoretz's autobiography to argue that the Cold War was a fabrication to arm Israel against Arab nations. Zionism and the Versailles Peace Conference. He points to Zionist influence at the Versailles Peace Conference as the origin of modern conflicts in the Middle East. George Bush and Zionist control. Mullins claims that George W. Bush's presidency is evidence of Zionist control over the United States government. The possibility of a U.S. dictatorship. He suggests that Zionists could install George Bush as a dictator for life, citing 9/11 as a step towards that goal. State terrorism and 9/11. Mullins justifies his belief in state terrorism and implies that 9/11 was a Mossad operation to reshape the world. Larry Silverstein and the World Trade Center. He cites Larry Silverstein's purchase of the World Trade Center before September 11 as evidence of a pre-planned demolition for insurance fraud. The goals of 9/11. Mullins lists national panic, government control, and the war on terror as intended outcomes of the 9/11 attacks. Part 4, Anti-Semitism, Jewish control, and future conflict. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Mullins perpetuates the anti-Semitic forgery, using its status as a forgery to claim its authenticity. Henry Ford and Jewish bankers. He praises Henry Ford for exposing Jewish bankers' attempts to gain control of his company, ignoring Ford's well-documented anti-Semitism. Holocaust denial. Mullins explicitly denies the Holocaust, claiming that Hitler moved Jews to camps to use them as bargaining chips at the end of the war. Jews as God's chosen people. He distorts biblical passages to present a negative view of Jews and fuel anti-Semitic sentiments. The Talmud and anti-Christian sentiment. Mullins highlights the Talmud's criticisms of Mary and Jesus to incite animosity between Christians and Jews. The CIA and Mossad. He asserts that both the CIA and Mossad are part of the same Zionist-controlled apparatus, reinforcing the idea of a global conspiracy. Eustace Mullins as a target. Mullins portrays himself as a victim of Jewish persecution, claiming that Jewish organizations silence his work and label him an antisemite. The need for another 9/11, he predicts that another 9/11-like event is necessary for Zionists to further their agenda and maintain control. The central bank mechanism and debt control. Mullins argues that central banks allow Jews to control the global economy through unpayable debt. World War III and Zionist predictions. He claims that the current conflict between Muslims and Christians fulfills Zionist predictions of 3 world wars leading to their global dominance. Jewish paranoia and ritual human sacrifice. Mullins attributes Jewish paranoia to their alleged belief in ritual human sacrifice, a common anti-Semitic trope used to demonize Jews. The goal of Jewish world power. He claims that Jews seek world power and will eliminate anyone who stands in their way, culminating in a major global war. This table of contents provides a structured overview of the claims put forth by Eustace Mullins. It is crucial to understand that these claims are based on unfounded and harmful conspiracy theories. Mullins' work promotes a dangerous worldview rooted in anti-Semitism and bigotry. What is the role of international banking in controlling the global political landscape? International banking and the global political landscape. The sources describe international banking as a force that exerts control over the global political landscape through debt creation, war finance, and manipulation of political systems. The sources posit that central banks, like the Federal Reserve, are privately owned institutions that control a nation's money supply by printing their own currency. This system, according to the sources, is designed to create unpayable debt, trapping nations in a cycle of dependence on these banking institutions. The sources allege that these institutions profit immensely from war finance, as wars generate significant debt that governments must borrow to fund. The sources go on to claim that international bankers use their financial power to influence political systems, supporting candidates and policies that align with their interests. They point to historical examples such as the alleged financing of the Bolshevik Revolution and Hitler's rise to power by Wall Street bankers, suggesting a pattern of manipulation and control. The sources present a controversial perspective on the role of international banking, alleging a global conspiracy orchestrated by these institutions to achieve world domination. This perspective is highly critical of specific groups, such as Zionists, accusing them of manipulating events like 9/11 for their own gain. It is important to note that the sources reflect a single, highly critical viewpoint and do not represent a balanced or widely accepted view of international banking. They should be interpreted with caution, and further research is recommended to obtain a comprehensive understanding of the complexities of global finance and its relationship with politics. How does the author's understanding of the Federal Reserve differ from mainstream perspectives? Author's views on the Federal Reserve. The author of the provided source believes the Federal Reserve is a criminal syndicate that is unconstitutional and controls the United States economy. This view sharply contrasts with mainstream perspectives on the Federal Reserve. Here is a breakdown of the author's key points. Private bankers' control. The author alleges that the Federal Reserve is controlled by a group of private bankers, including the Rockefellers, Schiffs, and Warburgs, who have held a monopoly on its stock since its inception in 1913. Monopoly and insulation. He argues that the structure of the Federal Reserve prevents anyone from buying control of the system, ensuring the continued dominance of these private interests. Fiat currency and debt. The author condemns the use of fiat currency, claiming that the removal of gold and silver backing in 1944 has rendered the US dollar totally worthless. He sees the Federal Reserve's ability to print money without constraint as a major problem, leading to hyperinflation and unsustainable debt. Speculation and war finance. The author contends that the Federal Reserve's primary function is to facilitate speculation and finance wars, which he considers the most profitable enterprise for bankers. He points to the Iraq War and Halliburton as examples of this. Control over the U.S. government. The author believes the Federal Reserve wields significant power over the U.S. government, overriding both state and federal authority. He argues that Congress has relinquished its constitutional duty to control the nation's money supply. These views stand in stark contrast to mainstream economic thought, which generally recognizes the Federal Reserve as a crucial institution for maintaining economic stability. Here are some key differences between the author's perspective and mainstream views. Purpose and function. Mainstream economics generally views the Federal Reserve as a necessary entity to manage inflation, moderate the business cycle, and ensure financial stability. The author, however, sees it as a tool for private enrichment and manipulation of national economies. Independence. While acknowledging the Federal Reserve's independence from direct political control, mainstream economics often emphasizes the importance of accountability and transparency. The author, on the other hand, portrays this independence as a means for private interests to operate with impunity. Fiat currency. Mainstream economics recognizes the challenges associated with fiat currency but generally accepts its role in modern economies. The author expresses strong distrust of fiat currency, viewing it as inherently worthless and prone to manipulation. It's important to note that the author's perspective, as presented in the provided source, is considered fringe and lacks support within the broader economic community. While it raises questions about the influence of private interests in central banking, it relies heavily on conspiracy theories and unfounded claims about the Federal Reserve's origins and motives. What are the historical and contemporary methods used by the author's alleged world order to maintain power? Here are some historical and contemporary methods used by the author's alleged world order to maintain power, according to the provided source. Control of the monetary system through central banks. The source alleges that central banks, like the Federal Reserve, are controlled by a group of private bankers who use them to manipulate national economies, start wars for profit, and create debt that can never be repaid. The source claims that these bankers have been trying to start world wars since 1885 to gain more control. They also allege that central banking gives Jewish people control over banks around the world through debt that can never be repaid. Manipulation of political systems. The source claims that elections in the United States are staged and manipulated, with candidates chosen based on their agreement with the desired foreign and economic policies. The source argues that the United States has been governed by puppets since 1900 when bankers took control. Control of information and media. The source alleges that major media outlets, including television and newspapers, are controlled by the establishment, preventing dissenting voices from being heard. The source claims to have been personally targeted, with talk show hosts allegedly shutting down their shows after the author appeared and spoke about these issues. Use of propaganda and fear. The source claims that the world order uses propaganda to manufacture consent for their policies, particularly in relation to war. The source cites the Cold War and the War on Terror as examples of this, alleging that both were fabricated to serve the interests of Israel. The source claims that terms like antisemite and hate-monger are used to silence critics of Israel. Exploitation of religious and ethnic tensions. The source alleges that the world order intentionally stirs up conflict between different religious and ethnic groups, such as Christians and Muslims, to further their agenda. The source claims that this strategy serves to distract from their true intentions and maintain control. Use of violence and terrorism. The source alleges that the world order uses violence and terrorism to achieve its goals, citing examples such as the 9/11 attacks, the Oklahoma City bombing, and the Waco siege. The source claims that these events were orchestrated to create fear and justify government overreach. Fluoridation of water. The source alleges that sodium fluoride is added to drinking water to make people more passive and less likely to resist the world order. The source claims that this practice was inspired by the use of fluoride in Nazi concentration camps and Soviet gulags to pacify prisoners. It is important to note that the provided source presents a particular perspective and makes numerous claims without providing supporting evidence. Many of the statements are highly controversial and should be approached with a critical eye. It is recommended to seek out diverse viewpoints and consult reliable sources to develop a more informed understanding of these complex topics. What is the author's explanation for the rise of the Bush family to power? The Bush family's rise to power, a view through conspiracy. The sources attribute the Bush family's ascent to power to their role as money managers for the Harriman family, intertwined with the broader narrative of a world order controlled by international bankers. According to the sources, the Bush family had no significant background prior to their association with the Harrimans. Prescott Bush, the father of George H.W. Bush, was hired by Averell Harriman to manage the family's finances. This connection placed the Bush family within the inner circle of this alleged world order, providing them with access to wealth and influence. The sources portray Averell Harriman as a key figure in this world order, acting as an agent for international bankers. He is described as having significant political power, even allegedly acting as the dictator of Russia from 1942 to 1944 during Stalin's purported nervous breakdown. The sources argue that Harriman's influence helped propel the Bush family into positions of political power. This explanation casts the Bush family's rise as a product of their connection to a powerful network of international financiers rather than through traditional political channels. This narrative aligns with the source's overarching theme of a world order manipulating global events for its own benefit. What is the speaker's main criticism of the world order? Speaker's criticism of the world order. The speaker in the source presents a highly critical view of a purported world order, which they describe as a conspiratorial network of international bankers, politicians, and elite figures who manipulate global events for their own benefit. The speaker's main criticisms can be summarized as follows. Control through debt and war. The speaker alleges that this world order seeks to control nations through unpayable debt generated by wars that they orchestrate. They claim that central banks, including the Federal Reserve, play a crucial role in this scheme by printing fiat currency and financing wars, leading to economic instability and dependence on these institutions. Manipulation of political systems. The speaker argues that the world order manipulates political systems to install puppet leaders who advance their agenda. They cite the Bush family as an example, claiming their rise to power was orchestrated through connections with powerful banking families like the Harrimans. The speaker also believes that elections are staged and that true political opposition is suppressed. Control of information and suppression of dissent. The speaker contends that the world order controls major media outlets to shape public opinion and silence dissent. They claim that individuals who expose their schemes, like themselves, are blacklisted and prevented from reaching a wider audience. Exploitation of religious and ethnic conflicts. The speaker accuses the world order of fomenting religious and ethnic tensions to divide populations and distract from their true intentions. They point to the conflict between Christians and Muslims as a prime example, alleging that it is being deliberately escalated to benefit Israel. Zionist control and the pursuit of world domination. The speaker identifies Zionists as a key force within this world order, claiming they control the United States government and are ultimately pursuing world domination. They allege that historical events like the Balfour Declaration and the creation of Israel were part of this larger plan. They further allege that events like 9/11 were orchestrated by Mossad to further Zionist goals. The speaker's criticisms are rooted in a deep distrust of established institutions and belief in wide-ranging conspiracies. It's important to note that the speaker's perspective relies heavily on conjecture, anecdotal evidence, and generalizations about entire groups of people. This perspective should be critically examined and corroborated with information from a variety of sources before forming conclusions. What specific event does the speaker identify as evidence of the Zionist control of the United States? Zionist control and 9/11. The speaker in the source identifies the 9/11 attacks as a specific event that demonstrates Zionist control of the United States. They make several claims to support this assertion. Mossad Orchestration. The speaker directly attributes the attacks to Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency. They state that Mossad is generally credited with being totally behind 9/11 and that squads of Mossad people were on hand at the time it happened. Motivations for the attack. The speaker suggests that 9/11 was a deliberate act to change the world and advance Zionist interests. They argue that the attacks created national panic, increased government control, and fueled the war on terror, which they believe serves Israel's geopolitical goals. Larry Silverstein and the World Trade Center. The speaker highlights Larry Silverstein's purchase of the World Trade Center shortly before the attacks as suspicious. They note that Silverstein owed most of the money on the buildings and benefited financially from the insurance payout after their destruction. While they don't explicitly connect Silverstein to Zionism, the implication is that he was part of a larger scheme orchestrated by Zionist interests. The speaker also cites the following as evidence of Zionist control, although not directly linked to 9/11. Media coverage. The speaker claims that the New York Times and the New York Post reported that 85% of the Muslim world believed Mossad was behind 9/11. They present this as evidence of widespread awareness of Zionist involvement, suggesting that mainstream media outlets, despite their alleged control by the world order, were forced to acknowledge the sentiment. Control over U.S. foreign policy. The speaker repeatedly asserts that Israel exerts significant influence over U.S. foreign policy. They cite quotes from Ariel Sharon, stating that the United States will do anything we tell them to, and argue that U.S. involvement in conflicts like the Iraq War is driven by Zionist interests. It's crucial to emphasize that the speaker's views are highly controversial and rely on unsubstantiated claims and generalizations about entire groups of people. While they raise questions about the influence of various groups on global events, their perspective should be viewed with a critical lens and independently verified with information from diverse sources. What does the speaker claim to be the main mission of the international money lenders? The main mission: war for debt creation. The speaker in the sources alleges that the main mission of international money lenders is to instigate wars for the purpose of creating debt. This assertion underpins their broader criticism of a so-called world order that manipulates global events for financial gain. War as a profitable investment. The speaker contends that bankers view war as the most profitable investment, as it generates massive government borrowing and, consequently, significant interest income for lenders. They claim that this motivation has driven numerous conflicts, including World Wars I and II. Central banks as instruments of war finance. The speaker specifically identifies central banks, such as the Federal Reserve, as crucial instruments for financing wars. They argue that these institutions, controlled by a cabal of private bankers, can print unlimited amounts of fiat currency, enabling them to fund conflicts that would otherwise be financially impossible. Historical examples. The speaker points to several historical examples to illustrate their point. They claim that the Federal Reserve System was deliberately created to make World War I possible. They also allege that the Rothschild family profited immensely from financing wars, citing their role in funding Hessian troops during the American Revolution and their involvement in cotton trading during the Civil War. Contemporary relevance. The speaker connects this alleged historical pattern to contemporary events like the Iraq War. They argue that the Bush family's ties to the world order and their control over the CIA allowed them to easily orchestrate the invasion of Iraq, even though Iraq posed no real threat to the United States. They suggest that the war was motivated by a desire to seize control of Iraqi oil reserves and further enrich the world order. The cycle of debt and control. The speaker argues that the cycle of war and debt creation allows international money lenders to exert control over nations. Governments, burdened by massive debts incurred during wars, become increasingly dependent on these lenders, allowing them to dictate economic and political policies. This dynamic, they claim, has led to the United States becoming essentially a puppet state controlled by international financiers. The speaker's claims paint a stark picture of international money lenders as warmongering entities who profit from global conflict and deliberately engineer financial dependence to exert control. While their perspective is rooted in a deep-seated distrust of financial institutions and belief in sweeping conspiracies, it's important to note that these allegations are highly contentious and require careful consideration and corroboration with information from diverse sources. From the source material which I have uploaded to you, please list 30 take-away key points with a brief explanation supporting each of the key point. 30 key points from Eustace Mullins' The World Order. The following key points, extracted from the provided excerpt, offer insights into Eustace Mullins' perspective on the world order, a purported conspiratorial network controlling global events. Please note that these points represent Mullins' highly controversial opinions and often rely on unsubstantiated claims, generalizations, and anecdotal evidence. It is crucial to critically examine these ideas and independently verify them with information from various sources. The nature and goals of the world order. 1. The world order exists. Mullins firmly believes in the existence of a world order, a shadowy group of elites who control the world. This group, according to Mullins, operates through secret societies and international organizations like the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations. 2. Comprised of bankers, politicians, and capitalists, Mullins describes the world order as a conglomerate of individuals with significant financial and political power, primarily capitalists seeking to increase their wealth. 3. Control through debt and war. Mullins claims the world order seeks to control nations through unpayable debt generated by wars they orchestrate. He sees central banks, including the Federal Reserve, as tools for financing these wars. 4. Zionists hold significant power. Mullins identifies Zionists as a key force within the world order, alleging they control the U.S. government and are pursuing world domination. The Federal Reserve System and central banking. 5. The Federal Reserve is a criminal syndicate. Mullins labels the Federal Reserve a criminal syndicate, arguing that it operates outside constitutional boundaries and manipulates the U.S. economy for the benefit of private banks.